Hi everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a real masterclass on how science attempts to measure the seemingly unmeasurable, our complex human traits. I'm super excited to teach you the structural foundations of psychometrics and really walk you through exactly how professionals go about quantifying the human mind.
Now, we've all taken tests at some point, right? School, job interviews, or maybe just one of those fun quizzes online. But we rarely stop to think about the actual science behind them. Like, how do you measure something completely invisible? Intelligence, anxiety, personality. You can't exactly put self-esteem on a physical scale and weigh it, no matter how heavy it might feel to us. So how do we scientifically capture it?
Well, here's how we're going to break it down today. 1. The core definition. 2. The 4 pillars. 3. Types of tests. 4. Real-world applications. And 5. The limits of testing. Okay, let's jump right into Section 1, the core definition. What exactly is a psychological test?
By definition, a psychological test is a systematic procedure for obtaining samples of behavior, which are then scored and evaluated by established standards. The absolute key phrase to remember here is samples of behavior. Think of it like a chef tasting just a single spoonful of soup to judge the entire pot. Time is limited, right? So a test uses a very small, carefully chosen subset of your behavior to represent a much larger whole. Everything else we derive from that test is essentially a scientific inference based on that single spoonful.
And these tests quantify 2 distinct domains. First, you have overt behavior. These are your observable actions, stuff anyone in the room could physically see you doing. Then you have covert behavior. Those are the internal states happening inside your mind, like your thought processes or emotional reactions. A truly great psychological test is designed to measure human characteristics across both of these domains.
So the crucial takeaway here is that tests are used to infer what we call hypothetical constructs. These are abstract concepts, things like intelligence, self-esteem, or anxiety. Because we obviously can't see these constructs with a naked eye, tests act as our scientific magnifying glass. They allow us to make logical inferences strictly based on that tiny behavioral sample we just talked about. Moving on to Section 2, the 4 pillars. These are the foundations of a good test. To actually be considered technically adequate, a test has to possess what you might call the holy trinity +1 of psychometrics. We're talking standardization, reliability, validity, and norms. Without these 4 elements, a test is pretty much just guesswork. Let's break them down one by one so I can teach you exactly how a fair scientific assessment is built. First up is standardization. This means there's a strict uniformity of procedure in exactly how the test is administered and scored. This is absolutely critical. It basically ensures that all the variables under the examiner's control stay constant. Why does this matter? Well, if the procedure is exactly the same for everyone, we can be confident that any differences in the final scores reflect actual differences in the test takers themselves and not just random extraneous variables, like how much time they were given or even how the instructions were read to them. The second pillar is reliability. This one is all about the consistency, stability, and dependability of the results. A reliable test has to yield the same or highly similar results every single time it measures the exact same thing under the exact same conditions. Think about it. If a test tells you you're highly extroverted on Tuesday, but then says you're highly introverted on Wednesday under the exact same conditions, that test lacks reliability. It's just an unstable tool. Which brings us to what is widely considered the absolute most fundamental issue in psychometrics, validity. It really boils down to one essential question. Does the test measure what it purports to measure? A test could be perfectly standardized and highly reliable, but if it claims to measure your intelligence and actually just measures your reading speed, yeah, not a valid test. Validity is all about the meaningfulness and the actual usefulness of the scores. Our final pillar is norms. Norms provide a vital frame of reference. And here's a fascinating fact for you. A raw score on a psychological test is completely scientifically meaningless on its own. If I tell you that you scored a 45, that literally tells you nothing. It only gains meaning when it's compared to the performance data of a specific normative or standardization sample. Norms are what allow us to identify exactly where your score stands relative to a larger group of people. All right, let's look at Section 3, types of tests. We're going to categorize the tools of psychometrics. Broadly speaking, tests fall into 2 major categories. Ability tests are designed to measure your maximum performance. This is what you can do when you're trying your absolute hardest, usually focusing on speed and accuracy. Personality tests, on the other hand, aren't about trying hard at all. They evaluate your typical performance, how you behave day to day, your underlying traits, and your general dispositions. To break it down a bit, think of ability tests on a timeline. Achievement tests look backward at the learning you've already accomplished, kind of like a history final. Meanwhile, aptitude and intelligence tests look forward. They're measuring your future potential to acquire specific skills or adapt to new circumstances. Now, when it comes to personality tests, the format changes dramatically. Structured tests provide unambiguous stimuli with strict rules, like a standard true or false quiz. Projective tests, however, use ambiguous stimuli, like the classic ink blots. The theory here is that you'll literally project your hidden motivations onto the image, whether you see a beautiful butterfly or a menacing monster. This helps reveal internal traits that you might not even be consciously aware of. Tests are also categorized by their administration format. Individual tests are given one-on-one, which allows an examiner to observe your unique problem-solving quirks in real time. Group tests, sure, they sacrifice that nuanced observation, but they provide an incredibly cost-effective way to screen large numbers of people all at once. Let's move into Section 4, Real-World Applications, why this matters outside the lab. These psychological tools aren't just academic. They serve primary functions across some really high-stakes arenas in our daily lives, from decision-making in schools and corporate hiring to clinical settings where they help classify mental disorders and guide treatment plans. In forensic and legal settings, they help assess competency to stand trial or even evaluate emotional damages. Counselors use interest inventories to help guide momentous life choices like career selection. And of course, in scientific research, they quantify variables to test our very theories of human behavior. Because they impact such life-altering decisions, those strict psychometric rules we talked about, they're absolutely necessary to ensure fairness. Finally, we arrive at Section 5, the limits of testing. Let's look at some critical considerations and caveats. We really must remember that tests are strictly a means to an end. The single most critical takeaway for professional practice is this: inferences should absolutely never be based on a single test score alone. A test score is literally just a number until it's placed within a larger, comprehensive framework of psychological assessment. That score takes on a completely different meaning depending on the individual's life context, their background, and their personal history. Furthermore, we have to acknowledge a pretty fascinating scientific vulnerability here. Tests inherently operate on the assumption that human characteristics are stable entities that can be measured completely independent of the environment. But in the field of psychology, this is actually a highly debated premise. Are our traits perfectly stable, or do they shift and morph depending on our current environment and life circumstances? It's a massive caveat that every competent professional has to keep in mind. And that leads me to leave you with this provocative thought as we wrap up this explainer. Are we defining ourselves by a mere sample of behavior? When we look at a test score, whether it's an IQ score, a personality type, or a career aptitude, how much weight should we truly give to that single spoonful of soup? It's an incredible tool for understanding, no doubt, but it is just one piece of the vast, complex puzzle of the human mind. Keep questioning, keep learning, and thank you so much for joining me in this masterclass.